Hi, everyone. So let's just get started in the interest of time. My name is Tatiana Polito, and I am a Senior Director of Evidence Learning and Data here at USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. And in this presentation, we will be talking about some research that was funded by the Private Sector Engagement Hub around how USAID partners with private sector companies to achieve development and humanitarian assistance objectives. And I was part of a team of researchers from Purdue University, as well as worked with a colleague in our global health office. If you can advance to the next slide, please, to generate this research that we'll talk about today. And as Priyanka mentioned, if you could kindly, as I'm walking through this, please share your name, the organization you're with, the sector that you're working in, and whether you're an academic researcher, USAID personnel, implementing partner, or private sector representative. I think that would help us to ensure that we can tailor our presentation to the audience. And here also we have the full list of researchers that worked on this partnering process report with USAID. And today we will have Dr. Priyanka Bhunesi also presenting with us. Next slide. So what really led to all this was the publishing of the 2018 USAID private sector engagement policy, which really outlined this new approach that USAID is adopting in engaging the private sector. And that means for-profit commercial enterprises, anywhere from multinational corporations, trade organizations and cooperatives, all the way down to local, small, medium-sized enterprises. It runs the gamut when we talk about private sector. But engaging them in helping us at USAID here achieve our development and humanitarian impacts in a sustainable and scalable way. And so to do that, we really needed to understand how to position USAID as a partner of choice for the private sector companies that we want to work with. And in order to do that, we're really looking internally and creating those conditions that we need in order to have that impactful evidence-formed engagement with the private sector at scale, and make USAID this partner of choice. And so within the strategy and the PSE policy, you'll see that we really focus on four areas for further information and development. That includes institutional capacity within USAID so that we're able to engage with private sector enterprises as well as companies in doing this type of work. The experience, being innovative and flexible, and then being evidence informed. And so that's the applied insight. And that's where this information or this research that Priyanka will talk about fits in. Next slide. So we had funded a series of work streams and research around the experience that we have in private sector engagement in the development space. And then specifically what we will talk about today is the experience that USAID has had in the partnering process. We're going to walk through some of the research. We took a deep dive into 8 case studies, but we'll focus on the education sector mostly. We'll talk about bottlenecks that are commonly experienced, feedback that we received in terms of how potentially to address this, and then relationship management, which is also a critical point. And so by the end of the session, we're really hoping to leave you all with a better sense of not only where some of the potential challenges might lie in partnering with the private sector, but also some resources that are available to all, whether you're a USAID staffer or you're an implementing partner or what have you, in terms of helping address some of these bottlenecks that we had identified and found through our research into these 8 case studies. So with that, let me then turn it over to Priyanka to walk us through what we learned and how we can potentially apply it in the future. Priyanka?
Thanks, Tatiana. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining. So before I jump into kind of our research methods, etc., I want to kind of acknowledge, kind of build upon what Tatiana was saying. You all probably, are familiar that, when we measure outcomes, right, specifically like say in the education sector, we're really focusing on how many students got trained, how many schools got trained, or resources they received. We look at these outcomes that are part of our programming. In order for private sector engagement, well, now we're really developing partnerships with the private sector in order to get those outcomes. One of the things that happens in this process, is, talk about in a bit, but if we don't understand, the kind of things start falling apart or things get challenging, it really affects our outcomes, right? So if we have the goals of achieving these outcomes, but if we're not really understanding, assessing, measuring the process of partnership, it can really have major consequences on our outcomes. And so that's kind of like the philosophy and the theory behind why we're doing this research. So just wanted to kind of start with that. And so moving into the research methods, we were really in what is USAID's private sector engagement process? How does USAID engage with the private? In that process, we really wanted to kind of break it down into 2 pieces. So one is this relationship management happens, going and learning about private sector and engaging with them. But at some point, that relationship building then gets formalized into a partnership. And so we wanted to understand what are the processes of that relationship management, relationship building, and then what happens once these partnerships are formalized and start the implementation process. So it's kind of like a whole life cycle of partnership. And in order to do that, as you can see, we used a lot of qualitative methods, particularly as Tatiana mentioned, we looked at 8 different and private sector partnerships, which were very, very different in different sectors, in different regions. And primarily we can, get a sector agnostic perspective of partnership. So it's not necessarily this is how you do it in education or in health, but overall what our lessons learned are. Can we move? So what did we learn? So step number 1, we learned that there wasn't even put on paper, right? Like in terms of what is that process? Where does USAID or where do private sector or implementing partners, where do they even begin to have this conversation? And when we, through our research, we found that it's not just a process, it's actually a full life cycle, which is divided into 3 main phases. So you have the exploration phase, the formulation phase. Exploration phase, it makes sense. It's all about exploring that relationship, understanding, is there even a need? How do you initiate? Who do you contact when you're trying to do all of this work? Into the formulation phase, if you have enough relationship built, you move into the formulation phase where it gets to the nuts and bolts of things, where you start identifying, is there a shared value proposition? You start designing your formal engagement, the procurement, all of you probably already know, USAID's procurement gets involved. And that's when sorry, am I giving feedback? Is that what, I can turn my video off for a second. Let me know if this, if it doesn't, can I continue? Shira, sorry. Okay, thank you. It moves into the implementation phase, where, of course, you've designed all your activities and you are, then implement activities. So it is, like I said, it's very complex, it's dynamic, things keep changing, but most importantly, it's very iterative. So it's not, if most of you have participated in this type of engagement, you know that it's not a straight line process where you go from exploration to formulation to implementation. And so it is about understanding that this requires a lot of time. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So let's, sorry, there was, we want you to kind of engage in a quick little activity before we move on. So if you can, there is a link to the Mentimeter in the chat for you that Shira has put for everyone. If you can go into that link and, very quickly, just kind of, if you've participated in these type of engagements, what are your perspectives on why some of these relationships that you begin talking to don't end up into full-blown partnerships? Shira, do you want to share the results slide as people are typing in? Great. Yes. Frustration on delays, timing, absolutely. Admin burden. Very true. The ownership, who's going to own the intellectual property, specifically when you're creating something new. Contracting, I'm sure. Misalignment, yep. We'll take like 10 more seconds if there's anything else coming. Capacity to collaborate, absolutely. All right, we have some more coming in. Commitment, yeah. I am enjoying all the different words because these are, it looks like there's a lot of different words, there's different concepts coming out here, which is great. Staff turnover, yes. Now that I have worked with USAID for more than 2 years, I can attest to that does take a toll. Different culture, absolutely. Great. I think that's a great start. We can kind of move on to the next slide then. And so I think everybody has hit upon this particular slide. So I wanted to kind of just acknowledge that, these are just few examples from our research that I have pointed out here to keep the conversation a little bit, streamlined. But one of the things, so in the exploration phase, what we learned is, the bottom piece, having clear value proposition was really, really important. And if we didn't, if people were like, yes, we want to end world poverty, well, that's great. But, how do you then understand what is the scope of that? How do you bring that down and have that kind of shared understanding of the issue that you want to address was really important. And if you didn't have that, the relationship didn't move forward. And the other really important one that came out, and this might be very, very tactical, but having an appropriate point of contact. A lot of our private sector folks, also were, they didn't know where to begin. Who at USAID should they pick up the phone or send an email to? And so some of those processes were really difficult to overcome. Moving into formulation phase, as I think some of you identified, the capacity to, yes, it's great to have this conversation, but do we actually have the funds available? I think someone said timing, right? The timing of the funds, do you have those? Do you have the resources to actually move into that next phase? That's where things started to fall apart. And then if you did get into the formulation phase, some of the issues that we saw was getting leadership buy-in. And this was at both the mission level as well as the private sector level. It was really hard to convince people. Alignment on specific objectives. So again, yes, we have this broader perspective, but what exactly, how do we operationalize some of this was really difficult for them. And then, yes, you also identified all of the processes, the regulations that USAID has in place, the procurement. It is very challenging for someone from the private sector to navigate all of that. And I think someone mentioned culture as part of that, right? And so getting over that was very difficult. And if you were even close to formulating, one of the last pieces where we saw things falling apart was this financial legal alignment and capacity, where things did not really move into the implementation phase. So again, a very quick glance of just some of the different things that we saw where things were kind of falling apart. We can go to the next slide now. So what happened? So now let's talk about what happened, what we learned when the partnership actually did happen. They were able to go through the entire life cycle and they were established. So as I mentioned, we had 8 different case studies and 8 different partnerships that we looked at across different sectors, across different regions. And what we learned when we did our analysis is that there are so many different ways in which private sector is engaged by USAID. So if you see here, and I apologize if it's too tiny, but the first model that we learned was where private sector engagement is actually conducted in conjunction with the implementing partner. And this was a really interesting model because the private sector that they worked with, the implementing partner really did most of the work, where USAID had, a smaller role in the whole engagement piece. The second model that we identified, we called it a philanthropy-based private sector engagement. This you might be much more familiar with in terms of big corporations, who have their corporate social responsibility programs. And the idea is that they want to partner with USAID, but they don't necessarily, they want to contribute financially, but they don't necessarily want to implement that program by themselves. So then they rely on an implementing partner to work with local stakeholders, whether that's communities, local government actors, et cetera. The third model that we identified was the impact investment based model. Here, USAID worked directly with an impact investment fund manager who either already had funds, or they worked with private sector investors to fundraise that money, and then identified local SMEs to invest these funds in. And so this was another very different model that came out of it. And then lastly, we call it the multi-stakeholder approach. And this is where our education case study kind of fit in. This was the most collaborative approach to private sector engagement, because all of the entities, so we had the private sector who had the technology, and I'll talk about the case study a little bit more, but they also had a lot of local partners like local universities, local government, and everybody was co-producing and co-creating the activities and as well as the implementation. So again, very different ways of configuring private sector engagement. We can go to the next slide, please. So where did we find the differences? What were the key kind of differences that made these models stand apart? There were 4 main themes that we identified. One was around who was initiating the engagement. So whose idea was it? Was it private sector who came to USAID? Was it implementing partner? Or was this USAID who came up with the idea and said, we need private sector as part of this engagement? So based on that, it was really important how it was configured. The second really important thing, what we identified, is what we call private sector's function. And we define function as a combination of their role and their level of involvement in the life cycle. So their role could be that they are either just funding, they are
could be an implementing partner as well. They could be providing implementing support. But the level of involvement also meant how involved were they in co-designing the activities, in supporting the collaboration and implementation of activities. And if, depending on that, we've kind of come up with 5 different functions, from financial support to co-partner, all the way to just being a PSE participant is what we call them. The third thing was about how closely private sector's commercial interest was linked to the designed activities. And this was also really important in whether, someone wrote commitment, right? And so if you have private sector commercial interest, something like mining, etc., but then their corporate social responsibility is in healthcare, and if there is not a lot of linkage between their commercial interest and what they're planning on implementing, at some point they could lose commitment. So that was another really important factor. And then lastly, who is leading the implementation was also really important, right? So we can kind of move on to the next slide then. So I will just quickly, again, if any of y'all have questions as I'm doing this presentation, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions, make this as engaging as possible. I'm kind of running through this because we have some places where we really want to engage all of you in some sort of discussion. So I'm going to take now some time to talk about the case study, the deep dive that we did specifically in the education sector. That was that model number 4 that we talked about. And the way of engagement from the PSE policy, it was about harnessing private sector expertise and innovation for higher education. We can move to the next slide. All right, so very quickly, I see about 20 or so folks in this session. And how many of you, with just a thumbs up, looked at the case study that was provided with the resources? Can y'all just do a thumbs up sign? Not a lot. Okay, so I'll assume that y'all have not looked at it, but I do want to say we do actually have resources in our resource folder. You can take a look at the actual case study. So if you can click the next kind of thing. So again, we found that in this case study, with the education sector, again, it was the same life cycle that was initiated, right? You had exploration, formulation, implementation, and then sunsetting was part of this as well. We can click on the next. So in this case study, we had a private sector company who was a technology company who really had an interesting idea for developing a center for innovation. They didn't have enough money to enter the market themselves, so they decided they want to come to USAID, and they brought the idea to USAID. USAID at that point said, hey, that's a great idea. Let's put in a concept note for this. If we can go to the next click. So within the formulation, what happened is USAID then, used the concept note, circulated this idea to other stakeholders like a government ministry and other higher ed universities. And, one of the most important things that they did as part of formulation is a feasibility analysis, and to actually, they visited different countries where the solution was implemented by the private sector in a different context. And what was really important is that all of these partners, after looking at that, really decided to tailor the solution that they wanted for their particular context and country. So that became a really crucial point in getting that value proposition across all the partners. They allowed, then they started working in the financial structure and developing, different MOUs, agreements, etc. We can click to the next, please. And then, so from an implementation perspective, they then started to kind of understand, we need a space for the center, we need to procure different technology, we need to establish a curriculum for students, we need to identify, how the governance committees will happen. And through that, they identified, how private sector and universities will kind of co-produce, co-generate these trainings and provide trainings. And then lastly, as the 5-year contract was starting to come to an end, they started to think about where, what is the sustainability plan for this Center for Innovation? You can click, please. So very quickly, if y'all can, in the chat for me, these are the 4 factors we identified if y'all want to engage in the chat, but who initiated this engagement? Just from, was this USAID? Was this private sector? Anybody? You can use the chat. So in this case, it was the private sector who initiated the engagement. Anybody can, type in what was the private sector's function in the engagement. So their role was, as you probably understood, it was to bring innovation technology like resources. So there was a bit of financial commitment involved in that, but also the level of involvement. They were involved in the co-creation from the start, from the design, they were really involved. The question number 3 is around how linked the private sector's commercial interest was to the design activities. As you understood, it was very, very connected. So the level of commitment again, was really high. And then who was leading the implementation? Since this was a joint effort, there was implementation that was happening with the private sector as well as the local universities. So again, this model was very collaborative in nature. We can move to the next slide now. So let's now just kind of talk about where did things get challenging. So the first bottleneck that they kind of encountered was in the exploration stage is when the private sector came to USAID, they did not, none of them had enough funds to go just by themselves. And so they really needed to include more partners. And that's how universities got involved, the government ministry got involved. And that got a little bit complicated. It took a little bit of time then to create that value proposition and operational alignment. I think someone wrote alignment is really important. And so the more partners they got into the process, it became even more difficult for them to find that alignment. This kind of trickled into the formulation as well is, okay, so when they're trying to design the MOU and bilateral agreements, again, it took such a long time from a legal perspective because of all of the different, alignment issues that they were facing. And of course, COVID happened at that time. So one of the big challenges that they had is they hadn't thought about procurement and how technology. So a lot of this, initially was planned in-person trainings, but everything had to become virtual. So how do you procure the technology, the customs issue? None of this was really thought through at that point. And so this just, as someone said, delays, right? The delays and the frustration keeps adding on. So it really impacted. So this is where I was saying that because of some of these issues, it started to impact their overall outcomes and the quality of the activities and the outcome of the activities, how many students were going to get trained. But one of the biggest things that came out of the challenges was the ability to think about what's next. How do we sustain this Center for Innovation? And it was very difficult for them to come to a master agreement on, someone wrote intellectual property, and that's exactly, you were completely correct. Trying to understand who owns intellectual property, how does this Center of Innovation get sustained over time, who owns it, became very, very sticky. So again, a lot of different issues to think about as we think about this from a process point of view. We can click to the next slide, please. And so what were some of the lessons learned? You can click, please. So step number 1 is there is a lot of time required, like you need a lot of time to understand these cultural differences, and USAID really needs to spend time working with the private sector to give them an understanding of the complexity of working with USAID and the development sector. You can click on the next one. So again, you have these technology companies who might not be local to that country, who want to enter into a new market. And there also needs to be processes in place to navigate some of these cultural language challenges that they were facing. You can click the third one. Again, I cannot stress enough, that has come out across all of the different case studies that we've looked at, is the amount of time needed to plan and budget for all of these different things that you might overlook needs to be really thought through. Customs and duty was one example for in this case, but really thinking through some of those design elements is important. And the last one, please. And thinking about sustainability should not happen when you're in year 4 or year 5 of the program, right? It needs to be incorporated as part of your program design, and some of that needs to be established right from the beginning, or have those conversations right from the beginning. So we can kind of move on to the next slide. So I'm going to have my colleague, Dr. Yuan Yi, talk about some of these different factors that emerge across all 8 of our case studies that were really important, as I keep repeating, managing the process and managing the effectiveness of the process. How can we do that, and what's important? And so I'll let her kind of share some of that.
Thank you, Priyanka. So this particular A case study that we have learned from many different sectors and regions. And one of the things we develop here is a framework to really monitor and measure the private sector perceived worth of continuing engagement, because we realize the partnership and engagement activity is continuous through time. And there are many factors that contribute to this willingness to continue to engage in this partnership. So it's very important to understand what are those internal or external factors that although they are very much influencing each other as well, but we would like to maybe discuss a little bit on what those elements are very important based on our case studies. So the first thing is the emotional effect. This is basically describing how the partners have a lot of energy, or in the opposite will be sort of a frustration that kind of start to kick in. And so there are different sort of spectrum of being more positive or negative in terms of the emotional piece. Now the other piece, it come down to the next one, is rate of progress. So this is more about whether there's enough regular meeting and meaningful discussion, and also whether there's activity output that can come out of it as scheduled. So really understand whether that's really on the timeline is also one of the factors contribute to whether the partner will continue to engage. The next one is really understand the perceived consequence of the private sector market, whether this is going to change their market share, they're going to create more profit, or there's going to be more investment. So really understand throughout the entire cycle, sometimes those things are changing over time. And the next one is related to the performance capacity. This is also related to some of the things we kind of touched a little bit. Their staff turnover, their personnel, they need to be dedicated to this particular activity, whether that's properly allocated. And also there's a lot of other external change, of course, COVID, for example, that is something out of our control, but how do you navigate throughout that process that is part of this factor to see whether there's enough capacity to pivot, capacity to really handle all the activity that's planned. And of course, expertise and knowledge, that's another piece that's very important. The next piece is operational alignment. This is actually we see in many cases that the attention to be paid into this particular area is extremely important. This including understanding the language and culture differences, understanding different pace of operations, and understand who are the decision makers. How do you actually making sure all the activity and the meetings and decision making, and that all can be bring the right people to the table. Whether it is aligned, misaligned in terms of the private sector and all the partners, as well as USAID, whether the regular their business operation is really matching. If not, then how do you address that early on? So the last two, relationship management, this is, we kind of keep talking about some of those examples. Communication, how do you communicate? I think one of the key things come up is the pace of decision making and whether we actually have the right decision timing, and also whether we have the decision maker in the meeting. So there's a lot of those cases also brought up. How do you actually manage the relationship for collaboration and making sure the decision making is keeping things moving forward. And the last one is everybody probably are very familiar with is the value propositions. Exactly why in the initial sort of perceived benefit of to be part of this engagement. And I just wanted to kind of point out that the value proposition in the beginning could be quite different once the projects start to get formalized and also start to be implemented, and also the sunset stage. So throughout a different stage of this entire engagement process, we recognize the value proposition actually change. Based on that particular case study we just talked about, in the beginning, there's quite a bit of enthusiasm about knowing this particular digital solution is going to be very helpful for the student, from the higher education institution point of view. Private sector are very happy with this potential market share that they may gain. But then throughout the implementation, they started to develop training materials. And at the end, there's even in the middle, when they try to decide where this particular center is going to be reside, it takes a long time to negotiate among all the higher education institution. And then at the end, there's an IP issue, exactly who has ownership of the center as well as the IP. So there's a lot of changes over time, and you can see there's a kind of quite a bit of list, but each one of them actually evolve, and they may tip the scale to the left or to the right. So it's more to the left if you add it up and say, okay, my value proposition is, it can overcome some of the frustration, can overcome some of the misalignment, and I will still be able to manage the relationship. So somehow the scale tilt to the left, then the partner will continue to engage. But once the scale kind of start tipping to the right, I think that's when you start to see the partnership start to, I wouldn't say abandon, but it will start to disengage, meaning there will be less interaction and less interest of continuing. So I want to give the slide back to Tatiana. I think she's going to talk more specifically on what are the key takeaway.
We have an engagement activity before.
Oh yeah,
that.
that's right. We'll have very little time.
If you can.
Yes, so
link it.
We will be able to put, yes, there you go. Please maybe use, I think people will be able to put the mark on which one that you have experienced probably has a lot more challenge in your private sector engagement experience. I think you can use
please, please click on the Mentimeter link that Shira has put in the chat, and you will see a little dot. And if you can move that dot to which one you think has the it was the most challenging, I think that'd be really interesting to see.
someone put relationship management, operation misalignment.
Shira, I'm getting the same error message.
You have to type in the code on top of the slide. Do we have more people put on the dot? It take a little time to figure it out. The code is 66107742 on top of the screen. If that gives you an error message there. So somebody put operational alignment, and there's also rate of progress, partners performance capacity. There's more vote on the capacity. I think we probably will just okay, so what are we gonna maybe, relationship management, yes. Rate of progress, got 2 votes. So we're trying to see which one I should come up the most.
We can give 2 more minutes to
Yes.
do this. Yeah.
All right. Do you think there will be more people submitting?
If anybody needs some more time, please put a thumbs up in your chat.
Okay, I think maybe we could move forward with the next one. So here we have seen several different areas. So if you could maybe put some recommendation best practice that you have used that to address some of those challenges that you have posted. I think that's also the mentee will just go to the next question. So it's the same link in the mentee. We're getting some very good advice here, including set expectation, reflection, pause, have common objective, and over communicate. I really like that with all your partners to manage expectation, because that is absolutely true. That's in sync with a regular check-in, proactive engagement. I think there's a lot to do with continue to communicate and make meaningful decision making and progress. Relationship building, excellent point. And also neutral, similar organizational culture. That's another very important point to recognize. Each organization, even in the same sector, may have a different culture. So I think those are very, very good suggestions. And what I'd like to do is let Tatiana to give the key takeaway from this study.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Yuan. So all of this, like I mentioned, we researched, we took a deep dive into the case studies. And so where does this leave us, right? What are the key takeaways that we want you all to leave with, and that we're further interested in here at the Private Sector Engagement Hub in terms of operationalizing? Well, there's three. The first is, as I think you've heard Priyanka and Yuan reiterate, is making the initial scoping of a partnership easier. So what does that mean, right? So that means over communicating, right? Understanding what are the motivations of all of the people kind of sitting around the table, where possible, co-designing, right? So bringing in all of the partners, whether they're NGOs, whether they are these private sector companies or an organization or cooperative, what have you, bringing them into these discussions as early as you can. Bringing in USAID, if that's, if you're a private company wanting to work and partner with us, bringing us in to these discussions early on in the development or in the conceptualization of the design. Speaking about sustainability, like what does that mean for everybody? It is a very fuzzy term. And so what is the business model that we're working here, so that at a certain point, we all know USAID, the government donor here, is going to step away from an activity. So what happens to it? And then having those decision makers, right? As Yuan and Priyanka were saying in the room. So sometimes, for example, on the USAID side, it's making sure that your contracting officer is fully aware of what might be happening, or your chief of party, or the decision maker on, in the company who's going to okay or green light the project is fully aware. Again, over communicating, right? So those are a couple of ways of making that initial scoping of the partnership easier, is over communicating. And then in that, you're also building trust, right? Through transparency of what's happening, what's going on, managing those expectations. Be explicit about your theory of change, right? And so this goes to the initial point of that initial scoping. Why are you all interested in, helping get women into, tertiary education programs? Why are you interested in, these developing additional teacher trainings in this particular geographic area or in this particular region, right? Is it a corporate social responsibility type of activity that this multinational corporation who's approached USAID or approached an implementing partner, is that what's motivating them? Because a lot of those questions then, and a lot of those answers then shape the way that you would design your partnership, right? If it's corporate social responsibility, it's not a core business model. So it's going to be much more kind of in the mindset of like a philanthropic nature, versus there is a company, a local company, who they see this as part of their core business model. And so then their sustainability, right, and the connections that USAID or the implementing partner can facilitate mean something different. And so all of these things need to be very clearly laid out and discussed, right? And sometimes it might be discussed in a language that USAID is comfortable in or implementing partners are comfortable in. Sometimes it's different words, it's just vocabulary, but I think what's important is getting the intent and the idea. And then finally, as Yuan led us through, it's regularly assessing that health of the engagement, right? Constantly managing that relationship, being in touch, communicating, if there are delays, why are there delays? If there's, a need to remain flexible from any of the parties, making that all explicitly clear, no surprises. I think that really goes a long way in terms of creating transparency, building trust. And so that way, when you do reach some challenges, delays, what have you, there's enough trust there to say, okay, we'll work through it, as opposed to walking away. And so those are a couple of ways of really implementing and thinking about what this research was really telling us, and what people who went through these partnerships and some of these challenges really reflected on. And then ultimately, sometimes these partnerships like this just don't work, right? And so that's part of the nature of this work. I think what's really important is to then stop and reflect on why, right? Was it a misalignment in incentives? Was it a lack of communication? Was it delays that just weren't feasible anymore to really manage? What was it? Because in those reflections, then better for next time, right? And so you can then address them hopefully the next time around that you are trying to engage with private sector companies, or private sector companies are trying to engage with USAID and implementing partners in trying to improve the well-being of communities. Next, please. And so I also wanted to make sure that we left you with some tools. And so there are a lot of different tools that we here at USAID are developing, have developed, and some of the links are here, and they can be very useful in the different phases of the partnering process. And so we will, thank you, Shira. Shira just shared a link of that, a link to it, I think, to this slide with all of these tools. If not, you can always reach out to us. If you go to the last slide, Shira, we'll leave you with our email addresses. We are always available to discuss whether you're with USAID, an implementing partner, a private sector enterprise or institution that's interested in working in this space. If it's not us, we can point you to the correct people to discuss this with. But we didn't want you to walk away here without at least some tools to help you think about this a little bit more and make partnering with private sector enterprises or partnering with USAID and implementing partners a little bit easier, so that we can achieve our goals in helping and making a lot of these communities that we support healthy and vibrant. So thank you all. If you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we are happy to discuss and answer any questions you might have.
We can, since it is a pretty small group, if you have a question, you want to unmute and share your question as well, we can have a pretty informal discussion in here. While we're waiting for y'all to think about a question for us, I can also add one more thing to what what key takeaways Tatiana said is, as we looked at the 8 different case studies, one of the things that we really learned is that USAID and implementing partners live and breathe this development, the world of development, right? And a lot of the way theory of changes are designed is from a very development point of view. And when we interviewed a lot of the private sector, they don't come from the world of development. For them, like we keep harping on value proposition, but it's at the end of the day, it's survival of a business. It's about profit making, etc. And so how I think thinking through how the theory of change can actually incorporate these private sector perspectives. So not just looking at it from a development perspective, but truly like thinking about what impact would it be on the private sector as well as you are partnering with them is a really important aspect for this engagement to sustain. So just another kind of thought process that we learned. But feel free if you want to unmute. I know there was in the chat, Naveen, I don't know if you're still here. He had said, but if y'all have even similar experiences that you're willing to share, please go ahead. Very quiet group today.